So thank you all once again for coming to the conference this weekend. It's wonderful to gather together, and we hope that we will multiply as the years go on. Our first question that I'm going to ask that was submitted kind of deals with somewhat of, I think, Brian's conference, the legality of the Mass. So the question is, the Novus Ordo Mass is considered valid along with the traditional Latin Mass according to multiple popes. Are the popes wrong? So I think this question deals with papal infallibility as well as authority. Maybe Father could lead us off with an answer to that question.
Well, son, actually, I think we'll defer to Brian here since it was his talk. But I don't think. No, I was just going to say, I think that Brian McCall made it clear the distinction between the validity and then laicity and the legitimacy. So I think, to just give a quick answer, we're basically, in general, accepting the validity of the new Mass. So that in itself wouldn't call into question, let's say, the authority or even infallibility of the Pope. What is being called into question is the legitimacy of the new Mass. Now, I guess, then maybe the question could be, well, then the popes aren't questioning the legitimacy. So does that say something about the Pope's authority?
So I think we all probably hear that, well, who do you think you are to say that you shouldn't attend the new Mass? Or, are you more Catholic than the Pope? That kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I'll pass the microphone to Brian, but I would what I would say is this, though. What I would say is this, that one has to understand also papal authority and papal infallibility. I mean, the Pope's authority is ultimately to guard and transmit faithfully the deposit of faith. And so that's why he's given authority. He is not above the deposit of faith. I mean, he doesn't have the authority to change the faith. I would argue that the same holds for the liturgical tradition of the Catholic Church. And I would argue that based on what we call the lex orandi, lex credendi, the law of worship and the law of faith. You cannot change the law of faith. You can't invent new doctrine. Well, you cannot make radical changes to the liturgical tradition of the Catholic Church. Just like the Pope is not above the faith of the Church, he's not above the liturgical tradition of the Catholic Church. And I think evidence of that is also the fact that Pope Paul VI, in promulgating the new Mass, he never, correct me if I'm wrong, please here, brethren, gentlemen, he never abrogated the traditional Latin Mass. I mean, and I would argue a recognition that he didn't have authority to do that. The liturgy, just like the faith, the liturgy is above the Pope. He's there to serve it. He's there to preserve it. He's there to protect it.
So, yeah, I do think we have to make some distinctions answering the question. First of all, the popes have never, none of the post-conciliar popes have never declared every Novus Ordo Mass in every parish is valid. That's not a true statement. And in fact, there's never been an infallible declaration by the Pope saying the ritual of the new Mass is invalid. Now, theologians would say, I think the common opinion is the Pope couldn't promulgate a form in and of itself that's invalid. But that's a theological opinion, right? But we know, again, that's why I tried to emphasize, validity is this minimalist question. And when it comes to validity of the sacraments, the Church, I mean, in necessity, can get pretty basic, right? Maximilian Kolbe in Auschwitz, he didn't have servers and candles and flour. He didn't have 3 linen cloths. He had the bare minimum. The Church acted as if he could confect the sacrament because that's all he had. So the question of, is the form of the consecration valid, right, is such a very minimalist question. But even if you say it is, which, say, Archbishop Lefebvre, for example, said, certainly this could confect the sacrament, it appears to be valid. But that doesn't mean in every parish it's validity, because you need more than that, first of all, for validity of a particular Mass, right? You need the proper matter, which is, and that's why the Archbishop, I think, always said, there's a multiplicity of doubtfully valid Masses, not because the words of the form were invalid, but as more and more priests who lose their sense of the faith and the rubrics are using invalid matter, are forming a contrary intention, right? A contrary intention to what they're supposed to be doing than those individual masses. And so none of the popes have ever said all the people saying, all the priests offering the new mass are valid or invalid. They couldn't. And frankly, it's a factual judgment. There's no way they could know what's happening. So, anybody else want to?
All right, so our next question is somewhat related to the first. If the traditional Mass is not possible to attend, I'm presuming in whoever this person's area is, if it's not possible to attend, is it a mortal sin to not attend the Novus Ordo Mass in their area?
Is it a mortal sin to not attend? No, I would definitely argue no. And remember also even from Brian McCall's talks, from his talk, you can't be obligated. Remember also the distinction he made between the divine law and the ecclesiastical law. What is the divine law is that you have to keep holy the Lord's day. And so that you absolutely have to do. Now, obviously, it is the law of the church that one of the ways that we do that. I mean, you could say the most important way that we do that is by attending Holy Mass on Sunday. But in extreme circumstances, if one is unable to attend Mass, again, whether it's for physical reasons or even moral reasons, I mean, one is dispensed from that obligation. We are living, now obviously here, I guess one can argue against this, but I'm definitely convinced that we are living in extreme circumstances. There are legitimate moral reasons why a Catholic will object to attending the new Mass. And so, no, if one cannot get to the Latin Mass and it is not and one's local pastor or local ordinary is not providing it, one is not obligated to go to the new Mass. What I would strongly encourage you to do, though, is I would really strongly encourage you to do your very best to get to the nearest Latin Mass. I mean, even if it means making a great sacrifice. I mean, if it means driving 1 hour, 2 hours, even 3 hours. Look, other Catholics have done that. Not that long ago, some years back, I remember a Catholic family, they were talking to me about how, this was before Summorum Pontificum, so maybe let's say in the late 90s, early 2000s. They were telling me, and at that time there were fewer Latin Masses than there are now. So they were telling me about how every single Sunday, they would drive like 5 hours to get to the Latin Mass. And so and it was a large family. It was like, I think at least there were 6 children. I mean, I don't even know. I mean, those of you that have children know that it's a whole different ballgame, getting, all these children ready for Mass and all those, and then a long drive. So, but it was a large family. In fact, I think, now that I'm thinking about it, I think there were 8 children. But that 5 hours, I think the father was telling me, the husband father was saying they would leave like at 4 a.m. and I think there was an hour change, so the Mass was like at 11 or whatever. After Mass, they'd, eat, maybe spend some time, letting the children play, whatever. But, I don't know, by the time they left, 3 o'clock, they were back at like 8 o'clock so I mean, it was a whole thing, 4 a.m. to 8 o'clock, every single Sunday, they do it. Obviously, you go back in the history of our church and you have, people walking 4 or 5 hours every Sunday to get to Mass. So I would strongly encourage the Catholics. I mean, I'd say, look, try to get to the Latin Mass as often as you can, even if it means making great sacrifices. And then I would also tell you, look, at least petition your pastor and your bishop to provide the Latin Mass for you. They should do it. According to the law of the church. They're probably not going to do it. But again, then at least you in conscience can say, I brought this issue to church authority. They denied it to me. If for whatever reason there is some sin in God's eyes that I'm not going to Novus Ordo, well, that's on the bishop and on the priest, not on me. I asked, I want to go to Mass. They're not providing what they're supposed to provide.
All right. I thought this next question might be good for Louis, who's kind of our liturgical expert, resident liturgical expert. So I'm thinking this has to do with the newer translation of the new Mass, the new Missal, the third typical edition, I think. So does the new do the new changes made in the new Mass under John Paul II or Benedict XVI, I'm thinking it's the translation, change our opinion on the new Mass? So in other words, does a better translation matter?
No. Obviously, by requiring the English translation to be changed from all to for many, which is the proper Latin to English translation, is an improvement in that respect. But no, it doesn't change what's still all heterodox in the new Mass. And to go back to the Adiavani intervention or the brief critical study of New Order Mass, remember that critique is on the purest form of the Novus Ordo Missae, which would almost look like the traditional Mass, priests facing the altar in traditional vestments, using Latin Gregorian chant. So it's the texts of these prayers, the Eucharistic prayers, the ordinary, the propers. This is the biggest problem. So obviously, in one way, it's glad that they recognized that there was a problem with that translation and they finally decided to fix it. But it does not fix the problem of the Novus Ordo at all.
Our next question is for our two international speakers, Stéphane Wallier and Michael Semin. So this person asks, what is your country like as a Catholic to live in right now with the church and with the government? So this church-state relationship, I guess, in your respective countries right now.
Well, I would say that the situation, the state of the church in my country, which is Czech Republic, it's in the center of Europe, became in the last 5-10 years very similar to the state of the church in Western Europe. It wasn't so before, because during communism, even though there were very few Latin masses, they were tolerated. I knew some of the priests who would say exclusively the Latin Mass. They were 2 or 3 maybe in the whole country, but it was tolerated. All the other masses were new masses, obviously, but they were said in much more conservative or reverent manner, no communion in hand. In many churches, faithful would receive our Lord kneeling and so forth. A big change came with after in the 90s, when the borders became open and the influence from the West poured into the former communist countries. And during that time, the mindset of the faithful changed a lot. So you wouldn't find a difference between my country and perhaps Belgium that Stéphane represents today. So in the mainstream conciliar church, I would say it's more and more progressive. There is not much reaction. Even among the priests, I would say there is not much interest in traditional Latin Mass. Even after Summorum Pontificum, who really, if someone really starts to care about his faith and recognizes the problem with the Mass, usually does not seek the indult, but goes directly to the Society of St. Pius X. So that's the only apostolate that's really growing. So in a tiny country with 10 million people, we have already 10 places, 10 chapels or mass centers where the society priests. We have 5 priests of Czech origin. 2 more are in the seminary inside Skofen. So the tradition is definitely growing. And regarding the government, it's really, well, there is no clash between the government and the church, because the church is very liberal, and so the government is, doesn't fear the presence of the church in the society. But what I should maybe add is that the former communist countries politically are more conservative than the countries of the West, Western Europe. So in terms of migration, in terms of gender ideology and family matters and so forth, the former communist countries seem to be more critical about European Union and Western liberalism and so forth. So in this sense, I would say there is a growing concern and a rise of certain political trends that are conservative, are working in our favor.
Thank you. As for Belgium, I would say that the church in Belgium, well, how could I put it?
The land of Cardinal Daniels.
Yes, yes, the country of Cardinal Sunens and Cardinal Daniels, who were both my local bishops, successively. Actually, Belgium used to be traditionally a staunchly Catholic country. It was completely Catholic, 95% Catholic. That's how it used to be until Vatican II. Yes, for example, Saint Francis Xavier used to say when he wanted good missionaries for his missions to Asia, Belgium used to provide lots and lots of missionaries for...
Was Father Damien Malachi, was he?
Yes, he was Belgian, yes. And Saint Francis Xavier would often pray to the Lord, Domine damici Belgas, Lord, give me Belgians, give me Belgian missionaries, the very best. Well,
very good.
That's really long ago, So Cardinal Sunens, his name may be familiar to you, was one of the most important figures of the Vatican II Council. And since then, the Belgian church has been completely sterilized. I mean, there's a complete collapse of faith, of practice, whatever.
Was he the cardinal who got really into the charismatic movement?
Yes, he did. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Mm-hmm. And then he was succeeded by Cardinal Daniels, who was one of the guys who organized the Saint Gallen putsch against Benedict XVI.
Yes.
You see. So the Belgian church is completely liberal, completely hyper-progressive, and they're closing churches, almost every day. I mean, church attendance is dropping, catechism, whatever. I mean.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong. Belgium, do they still have some form of a monarchy?
Yes. In political terms, yes, we have a monarchy. We have a royal family. Yes.
Maybe Chris could comment on after you're done on maybe Belgium would be the first new Catholic confessional state.
It's already in place.
Okay. Okay. So that in religious terms, I mean, in 10 years' time, I don't know what will be left of the church in Belgium. Probably just the cathedrals in the main cities. And that's it.
Assuming they're not lit on fire. Right?
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Accident.
And
That we knew was an accident.
The Belgians were very active at Vatican II, so not just Cardinal Sunens, who was one of the 4 co-presidents of the council. So really a major figure of the council. But actually, no, he was Bishop of Lille, which is actually occupied Belgian territory. It's been occupied by the French ever since the 17th century, well, just like so many bits of Belgium.
Are there any French people here? Are we going to start a war?
Oh, if there's any French here, you just kick him out. Okay. They're invaders, imperialists. Okay. Lille is definitely a Flemish city, and Flanders is Belgium. So, but at Vatican II, the Belgians were very active. For example, Bishop de Smet of Bruges was one of the major proponents of religious liberty. Mm-hmm. And you also had the Belgian Perity, the Belgian experts, mainly from Leuven University, who were very active. So much so that the Italian coined the expression La Squadra Belga, the Belgian team, during Vatican II. It was a dreadful team, you know, the Squadra Belga, okay. But they were not quite as good as the missionaries of St. Francis Xavier, okay. Mm-hmm. And in political terms, it will be very short. I mean, there's nothing to be expected from the Belgian politicians, from the Belgian political class. And we have massive immigration. Belgium is increasingly becoming an atheist and Muslim country with massive immigration. Actually, the most popular given name given to babies in Brussels is Mohammed, you see.
Wow.
You see.
Wow. All right.
Apart from that, yes, we have a royal family, which is Catholic. I mean, they're churchgoers. They're relatively conservative, relatively classical, I would say. But actually, for the last 50 years, our kings have not used their, I mean, very little, their political powers. Because under the Belgian constitution, our kings do have some power. Really, yes. They're roughly, I mean, their power is roughly on equal footing with that of the parliament and the government. But, I mean, our kings are not using their constitutional power because they're under pressure from the political parties. Yeah. That's it. So, I mean, well, Belgium is a very pleasant country. It's pleasant in many respects, but as a Catholic, I mean, the picture is pretty bleak. Sorry to disappoint you.
So I'm just trying to keep track of the time. I want to make sure we get to Mass on time. So I apologize if we can't get to every single question. I do have one that's for each of the speakers, so maybe we can just go down the line and give maybe a 1 minute, 1.5 minute response to this. And it's a pretty general question. What do you think the progression will be in the church and the world? What is the next step of the enemy? So...
Okay, that's kind of a tough question, but I think one thing we are seeing happening right now that has not been really approached either in writing or in speaking. It's something I've kind of held back from actually talking about in any of my conferences, but I think what we're seeing right now is there are divisions being created on purpose within the traditional movement. And they're becoming liturgically based. I mentioned briefly during my conferences the pre-55ers on the books, and I think that's a very particular thing that's being done, that's emanating from the Ecclesia Dei Commission. And I think they're really trying to draw a line in the sand between the SSPX, which is attached specifically to the 62 books, and now they're getting other groups to get attached to the pre-55 books, to try to draw this line between the SSPX and these other groups, the Ecclesia Dei Commission groups. And I don't wish to speak badly about the other groups. That's not my intention. But it's starting to fuel these really vigorous arguments on the internet and Facebook, and I've been involved in some of them, especially in the part of these, the pre-55ers are calling them, which are embodying a form of neo-antiquarianism. It's because they're becoming the water carriers for what the Sedevacantists, the 9 here in America, were advocating that Archbishop Lefebvre so successfully dealt with. It was mainly a liturgical problem why he expelled them. That is, he explained to the seminarians in Ridgefield right after their expulsion. It was because they refused the 62 books, and he said, no, we need to accept them. Pope John the 23rd properly promulgated this work. Pius XII properly promulgated this work. They are the Pope. They were the popes. They were the proper authority. And there's nothing doctrinally wrong in any of those books, no matter who was involved. And as I mentioned in my conference, it's an absolute myth that Bugnini was the impetus behind any of that. He had nothing really to contribute to that at all whatsoever. So, and that, by the way, that myth is something that the Sedevacantists continued to propagate, and now it's being taken on by some of these other guys on the other spectrum. That's a big problem I see happening right now, because it's creating more division where there should be unity. we should be united over this issue of the traditional mass, the traditional liturgy. And now they're not only just doing it on our approach to doctrine, but now they're trying to do it on the liturgy itself to divide us between that. And I think is very dangerous, and I ask everybody to be careful about that because we need that unity. We should all be in the same battle together fighting for this, and now they're trying to break that apart even more.
Yeah.
Yeah. Without a doubt, priestly celibacy is next for targeting at the synod coming up in October.
The annual synod, right?
Yeah, and secondly, the application of paragraph 303 of Amoris Laetitia to contraception, so that in the concrete complexity of one's limits, one could be excused from the decision to use contraception. The principle applies across the board. Once you decide that one negative precept of the natural law has exceptions based on concrete complexity, the magic words, then all of the negative precepts would find exceptions. So those are the two things that are coming next, I think.
I would kind of second what Chris said. I mean, but in a more general way, I would just say, look, I think what's on the horizon is continued attacks on the faith. I mean, continued attacks on the faith, attacks on the priesthood, probably continued attacks on the Mass, on the sacraments, on doctrine, maybe specifically, like Chris said, in terms of also just the family and definitely sexual morality.
Another item on the docket, possibly for the synod, is the women deacons issue.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think also there's going to be more and more, you're going to get more and more bishops and priests that are going to be trying to pass off a toleration and even promotion of sodomy, the homosexual agenda. So, I mean, I guess part of the question was also, what are the enemy's next steps? I mean, I think the enemy is going to continue trying to destroy the church. And so I think we have to fight even harder to be faithful to our Lord and the church. We have to, I think, focus especially also on our own sanctity and the duties of our state of life. Pay attention to the message of Our Lady of Fatima. For those that aren't familiar with it, I'd say familiarize yourself with it and brace yourself for persecution, because I think the faithful Catholics are going to keep getting persecuted.
I agree with everything that's been said. I think absent supernatural divine intervention, which is not out of the question, so absent that throwing a wrench into the progress of history or the degeneration, I actually think if there are this female deacon thing, I think shortly after that, open schism, formal schism in the church. I mean, we're clearly in a de facto schism, not just me, prelates of the church have said that. But I think if the next logical move after deaconesses, in quotes, will be a purported ordination of women, obviously being valid. But if they move to that, I think the schism in the church will become even more open. Because of that, I think there'll be at least a few bishops who at that point say, okay, we can't go any further.
So anyway.
We hope. I mean, hope in a certain sense. We don't hope, but so...
Yeah, I have nothing to add to this because I just wanted to mention the formal schism. Nevertheless, whatever comes, we know what to do, right? Persevere in the faith. Because whatever comes, we know that we've won already. I mean, Christ won on the cross. So it's not an open game. We know how the game is going to be finished. But it will come. Perhaps it will come with a time of some persecution and some more troubles ahead. So 50 years of problems might be, doubled or tripled or whatever, but we know that Christ is the victor. I mean, and if we remain attached to him faithfully, so we'll win with him, salvation.
Yes, I would say in Czech, pravda vítězí. Can you translate that?
Yes, truth wins.
Yes.
It is the motto of the Czech Republic, actually.
There we go.
Pravda vítězí.
So this, just in the interest of time, we're getting very close to Mass. Final question in reference to the new open letter that Brian is a signatory to. What are we to expect from the new, possible results of the new letter? What is the letter hoping to achieve?
Well, I don't think we should have high expectations. I think we should be realistic, right? And the goal, those who are willing to do it. And again, always have to see this in context. There's a lot of bad reporting about this. Group constituting a lot of the same signatories and drafters already issued the filial correction to the Pope, right? Went to the Pope first, which is proper. That's legally what should happen. The Pope refused to answer, as he refused to answer the 4 cardinals. And so the only other alternative is to ask for intervention by the bishops. Will that happen? I mean, in a certain sense, I hope not, because I hope it isn't necessary, right? You hope the Pope, his heart is touched and his grace works. I mean, there have been, St. Augustine, there have been incredible conversions. Is it likely? No, but again, we have to pray for that. We have to pray that, because only a Pope can fix this, ultimately. I mean, ultimately God, obviously, but bishops and they have to do a role, but it's going to take a Pope to fix this. And God works with lots of material that is not necessarily what we would have chosen, but the ways of God are not our ways. So maybe the bishops will intervene, but again, I think what was important about it is for the historical record, at least, right? Because you can only do what you can do in your sphere, right? We're not the Pope. We can't do it. I know for me, I wouldn't want to be the Pope. I'd make a mess of it. So all we can do is in our place ask the proper authorities to do their job. And if nothing happens of it, nothing happens of it. But, again, we face God. We say, I did what I could do. And that's all he asks of any of us, right? That's all he asks. So humanly speaking, I expect there'll be a little news story about it, and it'll fade into oblivion as they move on to the next fire that accidentally happens to erupt 20 minutes after it's predicted to be an accident. And they'll move on. But again, the hope, maybe it will inspire some bishops to do their duty.
I just wanted to add to what Brian said. The most recent update that I'm aware of as the status of the letter, it's open to more signatories. And Mike, I think, is it Mike or Mike Hickson? Dr. Mike Hickson for LifeSite News. She's the one who published the report, and LifeSite originally published the letter first. So she tweeted earlier today, several priests and professors, one from the Sorbonne, and PhDs will be added on Monday, so tomorrow, to the open letter to bishops, raising the number of signatories to over 80. So it is gaining momentum. It hasn't even been out a week yet. I think more and more people are starting to realize, this is legitimate. Only the very few and with their heads very deep in the sand are resisting this initiative. I don't know if Brian had anything to add to that. No.
I didn't mean to snort contemptuously when Brian said we should pray the Pope has a change of heart, and we all pray for that, and I pray for it. But there's a problem here that I don't think we've ever seen before. There's something wrong with this man. No,
that's an understatement, Chris.
No, I don't mean just.
More hyperbolic.
Not just in terms of doctrine. There's a deep psychological problem in his makeup. And we know from his past that the Jesuit order considered him crazy. There is a derangement at work in his personality. He's blind to whatever problems he's causing. And I think that it's a problem that would require some form of therapy, perhaps. An intervention, some kind of medication might be of assistance, but it isn't just a stubborn old fellow with modernist ideas. There's a real problem of a psychological derangement that I don't think is curable except through some sort of maybe you should go to Lourdes and pray for a normal psyche, because the problem goes that deep with him, and that's why I don't see any prospect of him changing course based on any appeals from the faithful, no matter how fervent or how widespread.
Well, unfortunately, that is all the time that we have. I was going to ask Father if he would impart to us a blessing to close the conference, and for those of us who have to get to Mass, we'll have to hustle over there.